Hello, today we'll be speaking on sugoroku, not only a recreational activity, however, a channel for indoctrination, or the game that grooms a nation. Sugoroku, a board game printed on newsprint, has enjoyed great popularity beginning in the 19th century. However, it has existed for many centuries prior. It is actually thought to have originated from China during the 6th century, when Japan was importing many Chinese cultural and societal establishments. The role of sugoroku was to produce a widespread popular source of national social order and modernist assimilation, specifically during the Meiji era and following. The majority of sugoroku was used as military and national propaganda to indoctrinate the Japanese populace from a young age towards their loyalty to the government and the imperial family. The game also proposed, however, desired gender roles, political affiliation, colonialist ideology, and loyalty to one's military. Before introducing the sugoroku, I would like to go in depth of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Fear. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Fear was the Japanese occupation of Southeast and Eastern Asia, which was intended to establish a grand colonial order establishing pan-Asian and anti-Western ideologies. The colonial expansion and the Japanese occupation began following the victory in the Sino-Japanese War, which took place in 1895. The Japanese had acquired Taiwan, the Penghu Islands, and the Liaodong Peninsula. However, following the triple intervention of Russia, Germany, and France, Japan was forced to surrender the Liaodong Peninsula, which contributed to the anti-Western sentiments. Nonetheless, the establishment of the Pan-Asian colonial empire, Japan rationalized its notorious militaristic occupations by assessing the threat of the West and the growing influence of communism. It as well promoted a pan-Asian concept in which Japan could bring prosperity and civilization towards nations that it viewed as uncivilized and backwards. However, the Japanese extracted resources and exploited their lands and used it during the World War II effort. It enforced Japanese as the official language, censored anti-Japanese or imperialist sentiment, and secured deals with local religions to enforce political dominion. So exactly what is the relevance of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Fear? Well, in this particular sugoroku, Dai Toa Kyokin Meguri, a game created in 1944, it is a game of a trip around the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Fear, portraying the numerous colonial governments under Japanese domain. The manga artist who created the visuals was named Ishisaburo Sawai, and he lived from 1911 to 1989. It was published in one of Japan's most famous magazines, known as I no Hikari, a magazine that was widely distributed amongst urban and rural Japanese. I no Hikari was established in 1925, and it was one of the two most popular magazines in the mid-20th century. However, the historical context of the sugoroku, and especially during the time period of 1944, was that Japan was engaged in World War II, specifically in this Pacific arena against the United States. Japan had already lost numerous strategic bases to the Allied powers. Victory seemed very low, and Allied submarines began to destroy multiple sea routes for the Japanese, creating a strangling economy that could not cease to produce sufficient military equipment. Therefore, victory seemed very unreasonable. This particular sugoroku, Dai Toa Kyoken Megun, created in 1944, depicts a more modern approach to the game, demonstrating portraits of black and white of different Japanese representatives in the different puppet states of the Japanese Empire. For example, Subhas Chandra Bose in India. Despite India not being an actual puppet state under the Japanese, India established close economic ties and political affiliations with the empire itself. Furthermore, you have Ba Mao in Burma, Wang Jingwei in China, and Jose P. Laurel in the Philippines, who were presidents and political leaders of the Imperial Japan's puppet states in the East during the Pacific War. Moreover, you can see various technological advances, especially in military equipment, such as the Japanese naval ship, and airplanes. The sugoroku itself portrays many visual conceptions which help to channel and indoctrinate others with nationalist sentiment. For example, the photographic images of presidents and leaders of Japan's puppet states throughout the Asian continent symbolize the unity and the political prosperity of Japan's colonial enterprises under their domain. The use of yellow was actually very prominent as well, as it was used to depict the land masses, which yellow usually symbolizes the Far East, promoting the Pan-Asian ideology that the Japanese Empire was trying to promote through the implementation of the Greater East Asia Prosperity Sphere. The use of green as well emphasizes the natural environment of not only Japan's satellite states, however, it also is used to depict the uncivilization and the backward perception of life in many of Japan's puppet states. For example, one can see numerous jungles, which often is depicted as in a way to subordinate their puppet states. Red is also a very prominent color in sugoroku, and red is actually a representation in Japan of the sun deity Amaterasu, and it also represents authority and strength, which symbolize the victory of the Japanese military in expanding throughout Asia. Notably, the sugoroku portrays different states and their respective leaders through squares and circles. The most prominent circle, as well as the biggest one, is that of Japan. Japan is depicted with Western-like buildings and civilized by depicting a boy wearing Western-style clothing. The size of Japan in comparison to the others also defines Japan's superior stance in comparison to the other states and its role in leadership. Some of the squares are also split in half, as well as the circles, and it depicts the duality of Japanese rule with that of sovereign rule, in which, for example, the Japanese colony of Korea and of Indochina demonstrate the rule and the underdeveloped perception of the land prior to Japanese modernization, and the other half depicts Japan's modernized contributions to the land. All in all, the sugoroku was a great way to instill military nationalist pride into children, adolescents, and even adults, especially during the war period. The game emphasizes not only the superiority of the Japanese, however, as it also demonstrates their naval and air capacity and strength and their development in comparison to other lesser or deemed uncivilized nations. The goal of the game is to travel around through land and sea through Japan's modern sea transports and air transports, and eventually return back to Japan. However, both the game and the endpoint start in Japan, which symbolize the player is probably most likely a Japanese who is visiting the many imperial domains of Japan. The first player to travel around all the landmarks and reach Japan is seen as the winner. A dice is usually rolled and indicates the number of points one should pass from Japan's starting point to their prospective starting point. The game should be twisted around to complete 360, and one would start their journey through the northeast of the Asian continent, specifically the Liaodong Peninsula, into China and then India, and then eventually going south towards southeastern and the Pacific Islands, including Burma and the Philippines. The goal is based on luck and happens to be dictated by the number provided by the dice.
Visual analysis. Kokuhatsun Sugoroku depicts Japan's history from the arrival of Commodore Perry in 1853 to a developed Japan after the events of World War
Sugoroku, especially in the era of the 1930s, was a board game intended for both entertainment and educational purposes. During this era, sugoroku was used to educate the public about good behaviors, upstanding citizenship, and the current affairs the nation was partaking in. A prevalent theme was military colonialism that took place in the 1930s and 1940s. During this time, the Empire of Japan would conduct military operations in China, Burma, and all over the South Pacific during World War II. The Courageous Japanese Army. This board game was released on January 1st, 1939, as part of a series of sugoroku games based on Japan's military conquests. This specific game depicts Imperial Japanese soldiers seeing combat, naval fleets, air squadrons, and soldiers receiving care packages from the home front. It also depicts friendly relations between Chinese civilians and Japanese soldiers, even after the events at Nanking. This is a clear example of propaganda.
This sugoroku is war-themed. We see the image the whole board surrounds is the middle image signifying victory and people holding Japanese flags showing their support for the troops. The game begins with the military getting ready for battle and takes us through many events until finally the troops claim victory. The main color used in the entire board is army green, but in the center we see the use of red, which is meant to call attention to itself. The game was designed for the youth of the time as entertainment, but mainly to promote nationalism and implant loyalty into the minds of children from a young age. The board shows all the new equipment and weapons Japan had gained after the war, including tanks, machine guns, cannons, bombs, etc. The game takes a player through different stages of battle apart from the actual shooting and attacks. The player gets through each attack and has some checkpoints in between where we see the war nurse healing the troops, as well as other parts where we see civilians providing the troops with goods. This shows the audience how the troops should be treated. We know in the 1930s, the military was growing and taking leadership over the political parties themselves. And a sugoroku like this is perfect as propaganda to promote radical nationalism and show the superiority of the troops and implant ideas on how civilians should treat and respect them. This also clearly ties with the widespread idea that the Japanese government didn't do much for the interests of the peoples. Meanwhile, the troops were on the ground fighting for their country.